Section 34 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August, 1768 to 12 July, 1771 by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Section 34. Manners and Customs of the New Zealanders. Part 4. That these people have a larger share of ingenuity than usually falls to the lot of nations who have had so little or indeed no commerce with any others appears at first sight. Their boats, the better sort of them at least, show it most evidently. They are built of very thin planks sewed together, their sides rounding up like ours, but very narrow for their length. Some are immensely long. One I saw which the people laid alongside the ship, as if to measure how much longer she was than the canoe, which fairly reached from the anchor that hung at the bows quite aft, and consequently could not be less than feet long. But indeed we saw few so large as that, all except a few that we saw at Upuraj or Mercury Bay, which were merely trunks of trees hollowed out by fire, or more or less ornamented by carving. The common fishing canoes had nothing but a face of a man with a monstrous tongue, and whose eyes were generally inlaid with a kind of shell like mother of pearl in the fore part of them. But the larger sort, which seemed to be intended for war, were really magnificently adorned. Their heads were formed by a plank projecting about 3 feet before the canoe, and on their sterns stood up another proportioned to the size of the canoe, from 10 to 18 feet high. Both these were richly carved with open work and covered with loose fringes of black feathers that had a most graceful effect. The gunwale boards were often also carved in a grotesque taste, and ornamented with white feathers in bunches, placed upon a black ground at certain intervals. They sometimes joined 2 small canoes together, and now and then made use of an outrigger, as is practised in the islands, seldom towards the north, rather oftener to the southward. In managing these canoes they are very expert, in the paddling of them at least. In one I counted 16 paddlers of a side, and never did men, I believe, keep better time with their strokes, driving on the boat with immense velocity. Their paddles are often ornamented with carving. Their blade is of an oval shape, pointed towards the bottom, broadest in the middle, and again sloping towards the handle, which is about 4 feet long, the whole being generally near 6 feet long, more or less. But in sailing they are not so expert. We very seldom saw them make use of sails, and indeed never, unless when they were to go right before the wind. They were made of a mat, and instead of a mast were hoisted upon 2 sticks, which were fastened one to each side, so that they required 2 ropes, which answered the purpose of sheets, and were fastened to the top of these sticks. In this clumsy manner they sailed with a good deal of swiftness, and were steered by 2 men who sat in the stern, with each a paddle in his hand. I shall set down the dimensions of one that we measured, that was of the largest size. It was in length 68 1/2 feet, breadth 5, depth 3 1/2. This was the only one that we measured, or indeed had an opportunity of measuring. For the beauty of their carving in general, I fain would say something more about it, but find myself much inferior to the task. I shall therefore content myself with saying that their taste varied into 2 materially different styles, I will call them. One was entirely formed of a number of spirals, differently connected. The other was in a much more wild taste, and I may truly say, was like nothing but itself. Of the former, the truth with which the lines were drawn was surprising, but above all their method of connecting several spirals into one piece, which they did inimitably well, intermingling the ends of them in so dexterous a manner that it was next to impossible for the eye to trace their connections. For the other, I shall say nothing but refer entirely to the few drawings which I had an opportunity of getting made of them, premising, however, that the beauty of all their carvings depended entirely on the design, for the execution was so rough that when you came near it was difficult to find any beauties in the things which struck you most at a distance. After having said so much of their workmanship, it will be necessary to say something of their tools. As they have no metal among them, these are made of stone of different kinds. Their hatchets especially, of any hard stone they can get, but chiefly of a kind of green talc, which is very hard and at the same time tough. With axes of this stone they cut so clean that it would often puzzle a man to say if the wood they had shaped was or was not cut with an iron hatchet. These axes they value above all their riches, and would seldom part with them for anything we could offer. But their nicer work, which requires nicer edged tools, they do with fragments of jasper, which they break and use the edges of it, that are sharp like flints, till they are blunt, after which they are thrown away as useless, for it is impossible ever again to sharpen them. With these fragments of jasper, I suppose, it was at Tolaga they bored a hole through a piece of glass that we had given to them, just large enough to admit a thread, in order to convert it into an ornament. But what method they make use of to cut and polish their weapons, called by them patu-patu, which are made of very hard stone, I must confess I am quite ignorant. For their cloths, they are made exactly in the same manner as is used by the inhabitants of South America, some of whose workmanship, procured at Rio de Janeiro, I have on board. The warp or long threads are laid very close together, and each crossing of the woof is distant from another, an inch at least. But they have besides this several other kinds of cloth, and work borders to them all, which I have before mentioned. But as to their manner of doing, I must confess myself totally ignorant. I never but once saw any of this work going forwards. That was done in a kind of frame of the breadth of the cloth, across which it was spread, and the cross threads worked in by hand, which must be very tedious. But howsoever they may be made, the workmanship sufficiently proves the workmen to be dexterous in their way. One piece of notability in them I must not forget, which is that to every garment of the better kind is fixed a bodkin, as if to remind the wearer that if it should be torn by any accident, no time should be lost before it is mended. Nets for fishing they make in the same manner as ours, of an amazing size. A seine seems to be the joint work of a whole town, and I suppose the joint property. Of these I think I have seen as large as ever I saw in Europe. Besides this, they have fish pots and baskets, worked with twigs, and another kind of net, which they most generally make use of, that I have never seen in any country but this. They are circular, and about 7 or 8 feet in diameter, and 2 or 3 deep. They are stretched by 2 or 3 hoops, and open at the top for near, but not quite their whole extent. On the bottom is fastened the bait, a little basket containing the guts, etc., of fish, and sea ears, which are tied to different parts of the net. This is let down to the bottom where the fish are, and when enough are supposed to be gathered together, are drawn up, with a very gentle motion, by which means the fish are insensibly lifted from the bottom. In this manner I have seen them take vast numbers of fish, and indeed it is a most general way of fishing all over the coast. Their hooks are but ill made, generally of bone or shell fastened to a piece of wood. Indeed, they seem to have little occasion for them, but for their nets they take fish much easier than they could do with them. In tillage they excel, as people who are themselves to eat the fruit of their industry, and have little else to do but to cultivate necessarily must. When we first came to Tegadu, their crops were just covered, and had not yet begun to sprout. The mould was smooth as in a garden, and every root had its small hillock, ranged in irregular quincunx, by lines with which the pegs still remained in the field. We had not yet an opportunity of seeing them work, but once saw their tool, which is a long and narrow stake, flatted a little and sharpened. Across this is fixed a piece of stick for the convenience of pressing it down with the foot. With this simple tool industry teaches them to turn up pieces of ground of 6 or 7 acres in extent. Indeed, the soil is generally sandy, is therefore easily turned up, and the narrowness of the tool, the blade of which is not more than 3 inches broad, makes it meet with a less resistance. Tillage, weaving, and the rest of the arts of peace are best known and most practised in the northeastern parts. Indeed, in the southern, there is little to be seen of any of them. But war seems to be equally known to all, though most practised in the southwest parts. The mind of man, ever ingenious in inventing instruments of destruction, has not been idle here. Their weapons, though few, are well calculated for bloody fights and the destruction of numbers. Defensive weapons they have none, and no missive ones except stones and darts, which are chiefly used in defending their forts, so that if 2 bodies should meet either in boats or upon the plain ground, they must fight hand to hand, and the slaughter be consequently immense. Their weapons are spears made of hard wood, and pointed at both ends, sometimes headed with human bones. Of these, some are 14 or 15 feet long. They are grasped by the middle, so that the end which hangs behind, serving as a balance to keep steady that which is before, makes it much more difficult to parry a push from one of them than it would be from one of a spear only half as long, which was held by the end. Battle axe is made likewise of a very hard wood, about 6 feet long, the bottom of the handle pointed, and the blade, which is perfectly like the blade of an axe, but broader, made sharp. With these they chop at the heads of their antagonists when an opportunity offers. Patu-patus, as they call them, a kind of small hand bludgeon of stone, bone, or hard wood, most admirably calculated for the cracking of skulls. They are of different shapes, some like an old-fashioned chopping knife, others of this blank, or always, however, having sharp edges, and a sufficient weight to make a second blow unnecessary if the first takes place. In these they seem to put their chief dependence, fastening them by a strong strap to their wrists, lest they should be wrenched from them. The principal people seldom stirred out without one of them sticking in his girdle, generally made of bone, of whales as they told us, or of coarse black jasper, very hard, insomuch that we were almost led to conclude that in peace as well as war they wore them as a warlike ornament, in the same manner as we Europeans wear swords. Darts, about 8 feet long, made of wood bearded and sharpened, but intended chiefly for the defence of their forts, where they have the advantage of throwing them from a height down upon their enemy. They often brought them out in their boats when they meant to attack us, but so little were they able to make use of them against us, who were by reason of the height of the ship above them, that they never but once attempted it, and that dart, though thrown with the utmost effort of the man who held it, barely fell on board. Sometimes I have seen them pointed with the stings of stingrays, but very seldom. Why they do not oftener use them I do not know. Nothing is more terrible to a European than the sharp jagged beards of those bones. But I believe they seldom cause death, though the wounds made by them must be most troublesome and painful. Stones, however, they use much more dexterously. Though ignorant of the use of slings, they throw by hand a considerable distance. When they have pelted us with them on board the ship, I have seen our people attempt to throw them back, and not be able to reach the canoes, though they had so manifest an advantage in the height of their situation. These are all that can properly be called arms. But besides these, the chiefs, when they came to attack us, carried in their hands a kind of ensign of distinction, in the same manner as ours, or spontoons. They were either the rib of a whale, as white as snow, carved very much, and ornamented with dog's hair and feathers, or a stick, about 6 feet long, carved and ornamented in the same manner, and generally inlaid with shell like mother of pearl. Of these chiefs there were in their war canoe 1, 2, or 3, according to the size of them. When within about a cable's length of the ship, they generally rose up, dressed themselves in a distinguishing dress, often of dogskin, and holding in their hands either one of their spontoons or a weapon, directed the rest of the people how to proceed. They were always old, or at least past the middle age, and had upon them a larger quantity than common of the black stains that they call amoko. These canoes commonly paddled with great vigour till they came within about a stone's throw of the ship, having no idea that any missive weapon could reach them farther, and then began to threaten us. This indeed the smaller canoes did as soon as they were in hearing. Their words were almost universally the same. Haromai, haromai, hare uta a pataputa oge. Come to us, come to us. Come but ashore with us, and we will kill you with our patu-patus. In this manner they continued to threaten us, venturing by degrees nearer and nearer till they came close alongside, at intervals talking very civilly and answering any questions we asked them, but quickly renewing their threats till they had by our non-resistance gained courage enough to begin their war song and dance. After which they either became so insolent that we found it necessary to chastise them by firing small shot at them, or else threw 3 or 4 stones on board, and, as if content with having offered such an insult, unrevenged, left us. The war song and dance consists of various contortions of the limbs, during which the tongue is frequently thrust out incredibly far, and the orbits of the eyes enlarged, so much that a circle of white is distinctly seen round the iris. Nothing is omitted which can render a human shape frightful and deformed, which I suppose they think terrible. During this time they brandish their spears, hack the air with their patu-patus, and shake their darts as if they meant every moment to begin the attack, singing all the time in a wild but not disagreeable manner, and ending every strain with a loud and deep-fetched sigh, in which they all join in concert. The whole is accompanied by strokes struck against the side of the boats, etc., with their feet, paddles, and arms. The whole in such excellent time that though the crews of several canoes join in concert, you rarely or never hear a single stroke wrongly placed. That they eat the bodies of such of their enemies as are killed in war is a fact which, though universally acknowledged by them from our first landing, at every place we came into, I confess, I was very loath to give credit to, till I by accident found the bones of men well picked in the very baskets where these people keep their provision. So convincing a proof I could not withstand, so I proceeded to inquire, as well I could, with the small knowledge of their language which I had, and the assistance of Tupaya, what were their customs upon this occasion. They told us that a few days before a canoe of their enemies had been surprised by them, and that out of her they killed 7 persons, to one of whom the bones in the basket had belonged. That now all the flesh of these people was eat up, and most of the bones thrown away, which we found to be true, for in almost every cove where we landed, fresh bones of men were found near the places where fires had been made. The whole was still more confirmed by the old man, who we supposed to be the chief of an Indian town, which was very near us, coming a few days afterwards, and at our desire bringing with him in his canoe 6 or 7 heads of men preserved with the flesh on. These, it seems, these people kept, after having eat the brains as trophies of their victories, in the same manner as the Indians of North America do scalps. They had their ornament in their ears as when alive, and some seemed to have false eyes. He was very jealous of showing them. One I bought, though much against the inclinations of its owner, for though he liked the price I afforded, he hesitated much to send it up, yet having taken the price, I insisted either to have that returned or the head given, but could not prevail until I enforced my threats by showing him a musket, on which he chose to part with the head rather than the price he had got, which was a pair of old drawers of very white linen. It appeared to have belonged to a person of about 14 or 15 years of age, and evidently showed by the contusions on one side of it that it had received many violent blows, which had chipped off a part of the skull near the eye. From hence and many more circumstances, I am inclined to believe that these Indians give no quarter, or ever take prisoners to eat upon a future occasion, as is said to have been practised by the Floridian Indians. For had they done so, this young creature, who could not make much resistance, would have been a very proper subject. The state of war in which they live, constantly in danger of being surprised when least upon their guard, has taught them not only to live together in towns, but to fortify those towns, which they do by a broad ditch and a palisade within it of no despicable construction. For these towns or forts, which they call hepas, they choose situations naturally strong, commonly islands or peninsulas, where the sea or steep cliffs defend the greater part of their works. And if there is any part weaker than the rest, a stage is erected over it of a considerable height, 18 or 20 feet, on the top of which the defendants range themselves and fight with a great advantage, as they can throw down their darts and stones with so much greater force than the assailants can throw them up. Within these forts the greatest part of the tribe to whom they belong reside, and have large stocks of provisions, fern roots, and dried fish laid up, but no water. For that article, in all that I have seen, was not to be had but at some distance, without the lines, from whence we were led to conclude that sieges are not used among them. Some, however, are generally out in small parties in the neighbouring creeks and coves employed, either in taking fish or collecting fern roots, etc., a large quantity of which they bring back with them, a reserve, I suppose, for times when the neighbourhood of an enemy, or other circumstances, make the procuring of fresh provision difficult or dangerous. Of these forts or towns we saw many. Indeed, the inhabitants constantly lived in such from the westernmost part of the Bay of Plenty to Queen Charlotte's Sound. But about Hawke's Bay, Poverty Bay, Tagadu, and Tolaga there were none, and the houses were scattered about. There were, indeed, upon the sides of the hills, stages built, sometimes of a great length, which might serve as a retreat to save their lives at the last extremity, and nothing else, and these were mostly in ruins. Throughout all this district the people seemed free from apprehension, and as in a state of profound peace. Their cultivations were far more numerous and larger than we saw them anywhere else, and they had a far greater quantity of fine boats, fine clothes, fine carved work. In short, the people were far more numerous and lived in much greater affluence than any others we saw. This seemed to be owing to their being joined together under one chief or king. So at least they always told us, whose name was Tiratu, and who lives far up in the country. It is much to be lamented that we could get no farther knowledge of this chief or king than only his name. His dominions are certainly for an Indian monarch most extensive. He was acknowledged for a length of coast upwards of leagues, and yet we do not know the eastern limits of his dominions. We are sure, however, that they contain the greatest share of the rich part of the northernmost island, and that far the greatest number of people upon it are his subjects. Subordinate to him are lesser chiefs, who seem to have obedience and respect paid them by the tribes to whom they belong, and probably administered justice to them, though we never saw an instance of it, except in the case of theft on board the ship, when upon our complaint the offender received kicks and blows from the chief with whom he came on board. These chiefs were generally old men. Whether they had the office of chief by birth or on account of their age we never learnt, but in the other parts where tiratu was not acknowledged, we plainly learnt that the chiefs whom they obeyed, of which every tribe had some, received their dignity by inheritance. In the southern parts their societies seem to have many things in common, particularly their fine clothes and nets, the former of which they had but few. We never saw anybody employed in making them. It might be that what they had were the spoils of war. They were kept in a small hut erected for that purpose in the middle of the town. The latter seemed to be the joint work of the whole society. Every house had in it pieces of netting upon which they were at work. By the joining together of these, it is probable that they made the long seines which we saw. The women are less regarded here than at the South Sea Islands, at least so Tupaia thought, who complained of it as an insult upon the sex. They eat with the men, however. How the sexes divide labour I do not know, but am inclined to believe that the men till the ground, fish in boats, and take birds. The women dig up fern roots, collect shellfish and lobsters near the beach, and dress the victuals and weave cloth, while the men make nets. Thus at least these employments have been distributed when I had an opportunity of observing them, which was very seldom, for our approach generally made a holiday wherever we went, men, women, and children flocking to us, either to satisfy their curiosity or trade with us for whatever they might have, taking in exchange cloth of any kind, especially linen or the Indian cloth we had brought from the islands, paper, glass bottles, sometimes pieces of broken glass, nails, etc. We saw few signs of religion among these people. They had no public places of worship among them as the inhabitants of the South Sea Islands, and only one private one came under my observation, which was in the neighbourhood of a plantation of their sweet potatoes. It was a small square bordered round with stones. In the middle was a spade, and on it was hung a basket of fern roots, an offering, I suppose, to the gods for the success of the crop. So at least one of the natives explained it. They, however, acknowledged the influence of superior beings, and of nearly the same account of the creation of the world, mankind, etc., as Tupaia. He, however, seemed to be much better versed in such legends than any of them, for whenever he began to preach, as we called it, he was sure of a numerous audience who attended with most profound silence to his doctrines. The burial of the dead, instead of being a pompous ceremony, as in the islands, is here kept secret. We never saw so much as a grave where anyone had been interred, nor were they always alike in the accounts they gave of the manner of disposing of dead bodies. In the northern parts they told us that they buried them in the ground, and in the southern said that they threw them into the sea, having first tied to them a sufficient weight to cause their sinking. Howsoever they disposed of the dead, their regret for the loss of them was sufficiently visible. Few or none were without scars, and some of them hideously large, on their cheeks, arms, thighs, legs, etc., which proceeded from the cuts they had given themselves during their mourning. I have seen several with such wounds, of which the blood was not yet staunched, and only one, a woman, while she was cutting herself and lamenting. She wept much, repeating many sentences in a plaintive tone of voice, at every one of which she with a shell cut a gash in some part of her body. She, however, contrived her cuts in such a manner that few of them drew blood, and those that did penetrated a small depth only. She was old, and had outlived probably those violent impressions that grief as well as other passions of the mind make upon young people. Her grief was also probably of long standing. The scars upon the bodies of the greater part of these people evinced, however, that they had felt sorrows more severely than she did. Thus much for the manners and customs of these people, as far as they have come to my knowledge in the few opportunities I have had of seeing them. They differ in many things, but agree in more with those of the inhabitants of the South Sea Islands. Their language I shall next give a short specimen of, which is almost precisely the same, at least in fundamentals. It is true that they have generally added several letters to the words, as used by the inhabitants of Otaheite, etc., but the original plainly appears in the composition. The language of the northern and southern parts differ chiefly in this. The one has added more letters than the others. The original words are, however, not less visible to the slightest observer. I shall give a short table of each compared with the Otaheite, taking care to mention as many words as I know which are either of a doubtful or different origin. Premising, however, two things. First, that the words were so much disguised by their manner of pronouncing them, that I found it very difficult to understand them till I had wrote them down. Secondly, the Tupaya at the very first understood and conversed with them with great facility. Word, a chief. Northern, Iariti. Southern, Iariti. Otaheite, Iari. A man. Northern, Ta'ata. Southern, Ta'ata. Otaheite, Ta'ata. A woman. Northern, Wahine. Southern, Wahine. Otaheite, Wahine. The head. Northern, Upo. Southern, Heopoho. Otaheite, Upo. The hair. Northern, Makawe. Southern, Hiu. Otaheite, Ro'uru. The ear. Northern, Teringa. Southern, Hetaheye. Otaheite, Taria. The forehead. Northern, Irai. Southern, Heiai. Otaheite, Irai. The eyes. Northern, Mata. Southern, Himata. Otaheite, Mata. The cheeks. Northern, Paparinga. Southern, Hipapae. Otaheite, Paparia. The nose. Northern, Ahue. Southern, Hi'i. Otaheite, Ahu. The mouth. Northern, Hangautu. Southern, Hegowai. Otaheite, Otu. The chin. Northern, Ikowai. Southern, Hikeowai. The arm. Northern, Haringaringa. Southern, Rima. The finger. Northern, Machikara. Southern, Hemiagao. Otaheite, Maniao. The belly. Northern, Aterabu. Otaheite, Obu. The navel. Northern, Apitu. Southern, Hekapitu. Otaheite, Pitu. Come here. Northern, Horumai. Southern, Horumai. Tahite, Harumai. Fish. Northern, Heika. Southern, Heika. Otaheite, Eika. A lobster. Northern, Kura. Southern, Kura. Otaheite, Tura. Cocos. Northern, Taro. Southern, Taro. Otaheite, Taro. Sweet potatoes. Northern, Kumala. Southern, Kumala. Otaheite, Kumala. Yams. Northern, Tufewe. Southern, Tufewe. Otaheite, Tufewe. Birds. Northern, Manu. Southern, Manu. Otaheite, Manu. Number. Northern, Kauure. Southern, Kauure. Otaheite, Oure. Number. 1. Northern, Tahai. Otaheite, Tahai. 2. Northern, Urua. Otaheite, Rua. 3. Northern, Toru. Otaheite, Toru. 4. Northern, Ha. Otaheite, Hia. 5. Northern, Rima. Otaheite, Rima. 6. Northern, Ono. Otaheite, Ono. 7. Northern, Itu. Otaheite, Hitu. 8. Northern, Waru. Otaheite, Waru. 9. Northern, Iva. Otaheite, Hiva. 10. Northern, Anahuru. Otaheite, Ahuru. The teeth. Northern, Henihu. Southern, Heniahu. Otaheite, Nihio. The wind. Northern, Mihau. Otaheite, Matai. A thief. Northern, Amutu. Otaheite, Tito. To examine. Northern, Matakitaki. Otaheite, Mataitai. To sing. Northern, Eheara. Otaheite, Haiva. Bad. Northern, Kino. Southern, Kino. Otaheite, Ino. Trees. Northern, Eratu. Southern, Eratu. Otaheite, Erau. Grandfather, northern Tubuna, southern Tubuna, o Tahiti Tubuna. I must remark that the greatest part of the southern language was not taken down by myself, and I am inclined to believe that the person who did it for me made use of more letters in spelling the words than were absolutely necessary. The genius of the language, especially in the southern parts, is to add some particle before a noun, as we do the or a. The was generally he or ko. They also often add to the end of the word, especially if it is an answer to a question, the word oya, which signifies yes, really, or certainly. This sometimes led our gentlemen into most long-winded words, one only of which I shall mention as an example. In the Bay of Islands, a very remarkable island was called by the natives Motu Aro. Some of our gentlemen asked the name of this from one of the natives, who answered, I suppose, as usual, Ke Motu Aro. The gentleman, not hearing well the word, repeated his question, on which the Indian again repeated his answer, adding oya to the end of the name, which made it Ke Motu Aro Oya. This way, at least, and no other, can I account for that island being called in the logbook, etc., Kumati Waro Aya. The same is practised by the inhabitants of the South Sea Islands, only their practice instead of he or she is to or ta. Their oya is exactly the same, which when first I began to learn the language produced many difficulties and mistakes. From the similarity of customs, the still greater of traditions, and the almost identical sameness of language between these people and those of the islands in the South Sea, there remains little doubt that they came originally from the same source. But where that source is, future experience may teach us. At present, I can say no more than that I firmly believe that it is to the westward, and by no means to the east. Having now entirely circumnavigated New Zealand, and found it, not as generally had been supposed, part of a continent, but 2 islands, and having not the least reason to imagine that any country larger than itself lays in its neighbourhood, it was resolved to leave it and proceed upon farther discoveries in our return to England, being determined to do as much as the state of the ship and provisions would allow. In consequence of this resolution, a consultation was held, and 3 schemes proposed. 1. Much the most eligible, to return by Cape Horn, keeping all the way in the high latitudes, by which means we might with certainty determine whether or not a southern continent existed. But this was unanimously agreed to be more than the condition of the ship would allow. Our provisions, indeed, might be equal to it. We had 6 months at 2/3 allowance, but our sails and rigging, with which the former especially we were at first but ill provided, were rendered so bad by the blowing weather that we had met with off New Zealand, that we were by no means in a condition to weather the hard gales that must be expected in a winter passage through high latitudes. The second was to steer to the southward of Van Diemen's Land, and stand away directly for the Cape of Good Hope, but this was likewise immediately rejected. If we were in too bad a condition for the former, we were in too good a one for this. 6 months' provision was much more than enough to carry us to any port in the East Indies, and the overplus was not to be thrown away in a sea where so few navigators had before us. The third, therefore, was unanimously agreed to, which was to stand immediately to the westward, fall in with the coast of New Holland as soon as possible, and after following that to the northward, as far as seemed proper, to attempt to fall in with the lands seen by Quiros in 1606. In doing this, although we hope to make discoveries more interesting to trade, at least, than any we have yet made, we were obliged entirely to give up our first grand project, the southern continent. This, for my own part, I confess, I could not do without much regret. That a southern continent really exists, I firmly believe, but if asked why I believe so, I confess my reasons are weak, yet I have a prepossession in favour of the fact, which I find it difficult to account for. Ice in large bodies has been seen off Cape Horn now and then. Sharp saw it in 1681, and M. Fraisier in his return from the coast of Chile in the month of March, 1714. He also mentioned that it has been seen by other French ships in the same place. If this ice, as is generally believed, is formed by fresh water, only there must be land to the southward, for the coast of Terra del Fuego is by no means cold enough to produce such an effect. I should be inclined to think also that it lays well away to the westward, as the west and southwest winds so generally prevail that the ice must be supposed to have followed the direction of these winds, and consequently have come from those points. When we sailed to the southward in the months of August and September 1769, we met with signs of land, seaweed, and a seal, which though both of them are often seen at large distances from land, yet they are not met with in open oceans, and we were at that time too far from the coast of New Zealand, and much too far from that of South America, to have supposed them to have come from either of these. The body of this land must, however, be situated in very high latitudes. A part of it may, indeed, come to the northward, within our track, but as we never saw any signs of land, except at the time mentioned above, although I made it my particular business, as well as I believe most of us, to look out for such, it must be prodigiously smaller in extent than the theoretical continent makers have supposed it to be. We have by our track proved the absolute falsity of above 3/4 of their positions, and after that the remaining part cannot be much relied upon. But above all we have taken from them their firmest groundwork, in proving New Zealand to be an island, which I believe was looked upon even by the most thinking people to be in all probability at least a part of some vast country. All this we have taken from them: the land seen by Juan Fernandez, the land seen by the Dutch squadron under Hermite, signs of continent seen by Quiros, and the same by Roggeveen, etc., etc., have by us been proved not to have at all related to a continent. As for their reasoning about the balancing of the two poles, which always appeared to me to be a most childish argument, we have already shorn off so much of their supposed counterbalancing land, that by their own account the South Pole would already be too light, unless that which we have left should be made of a very ponderous materials. As much fault as I find with these gentlemen will, however, probably recoil on myself, when I, on so slight grounds as those I have mentioned, again declare it to be my opinion that a southern continent exists, an opinion in favour of which I am strongly prepossessed. But foolish and weak as all prepossessions must be thought, I would not but declare myself so, lest I might be supposed to have stronger reasons, which I concealed. To search for this continent, then, the best and readiest way by which, at once, the existence or non-existence of it might be proved, appears to me to be this: let the ship or ships destined for this service leave England in the spring, and proceed directly to the Cape of Good Hope, where they might refresh their people and supply in some articles their expensive provision. From thence to proceed round Van Diemen's Land to the coast of New Zealand, where they might again refresh in any of the numerous harbours at the mouth of Cook's Strait, where they would be sure to meet with plenty of water, wood, and fish. Here they should arrive at the month of October, that they might have the good season before them to run across the South Sea, which by reason of the prevailing westerly winds they would easily be able to do in any latitude, and if in doing this they should not fall in with a continent, they might still be of service by exploring the islands in the Pacific Ocean, where they might refresh themselves, and proceed home by the East Indies. Such a voyage, as a voyage of mere curiosity, should be promoted by the Royal Society, to whom I doubt not but His Majesty would upon a proper application grant a ship, as the subject of such a voyage seems at least as interesting to science in general, and the increase of knowledge, as the observation which gave rise to the present one. The small expense which an equipment is to government is easily shown. I will venture roundly to affirm that the smallest station sloop in His Majesty's service is every year more expensive than this ship, where every rope, every sail, every rope yarn even, is obliged to do its duty most thoroughly before it can be dismissed. How trifling then must this expense appear, when in return for it the nation acquires experienced seamen in those who execute it, and the praise which is never denied to countries who in this public-spirited manner promote the increase of knowledge. At the Cape of Good Hope might be procured beef, bread, flour, peas, spirit, or indeed any kind of provision at reasonable rates. The beef must be bought alive and salted, for which purpose it would be proper to take out salt from Europe. The general price, which indeed never varies, is 2d. a pound. It is tolerable meat, but not so fat as ours in England. Pork is scarce and dear, of that therefore a larger proportion might be taken out. Bread, which varies in price, is of the rusk kind, very good, but rather brown. Spirit is arrack from Batavia, the price of which, after having been paid the duties of import and export, is 60 rd, 12 pounds sterling, a ledger of 150 gallons. Wine is in vast supply and very cheap. While I was there, they began to distill a kind of brandy, which, however, at that time was as dear as arrack, and much inferior to it, both in strength and goodness. Should a ship upon this expedition be obliged to go into False Bay, into which the Dutch remove on the 12th of May, most of these articles might be got there at a small advance occasioned by the carriage, which is very cheap, and any be wanted which could not, they might be brought from the Cape Town either by Dutch scoots, of which there are several belonging to the company in the harbour, or by waggons overland, as the road is good and much frequented at that season of the year. End of section 34. Part 4 of the Manners and Customs of the New Zealanders.